topic tonight is suppressing free speech, criminalising protest, Palestine and beyond. And our speakers are the Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, who I'm sure you all know because he's a member of the committee and has spoken before, who is from the University of Sydney. He is the co-founder of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, and then for the Sydney Peace Foundation. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Slezak from the University of New South Wales, who is also the executive of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network and the co-founder of the independent Australian, sorry, I can't read my own writing, Jewish Voices, yes, sorry, not being able to read my own writing. Okay, so I'll hand over to Stuart, who's going to speak first.
Okay, well, let me first of all acknowledge the Indigenous people on whose land we are conducting this meeting, and it's always pertinent to do that when we're talking about the plight of another Indigenous people, because my argument for years has been that 1788 is actually 1948, if you think about the incredible similarity between the events of those 2 years. I'm going to kick off by just reminding myself and you a bit about the sort of historical momentum behind the respect for freedom of speech, which we're losing. We're going to talk about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, not so much as because of its inherent value for the people of Palestine, but because it's a shining example of how other groups might learn to resist the criminalization of protests that's going on around the world. Start off with the trial of Socrates, 399 BC. I throw that in order to impress my philosophical colleague. I remember he was made the offer that if he shut up, he could go free. But he replied that he would abide by the wisdom of the gods, namely his own conscience, and not the dictates of the men of Athens. Fast forward to 18th century France, and we have Voltaire disagreeing openly with Abbe somebody or other, whose writing he couldn't stand, but he said he would defend to the end of his days the right of this guy to write and say what he liked. If you looked at the First Amendments to the American Constitution, you'll see at least 5 freedoms enunciated there. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the right to protest. Virtually a Bill of Rights, something that Australia does not have. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, particularly Clause 19, it talks about respect for freedom of expression, irrespective of frontiers. In other words, the principle of freedom of expression was more important than the claims about border protection in so-called sovereign states. Nevertheless, and this is the second area of thought, authoritarianism is on the rise. It's easy to make the point about appalling regimes who wouldn't know anything about freedom of speech, whether it's Putin's Russia or Sharma's Saudi Arabia or Erdogan's Turkey or Netanyahu's Israel. It's easy to make, to see that freedom of speech and the suppression of those who might protest is central to the politics of those parts of the world. But it's also become somewhat central to Mike Baird's New South Wales. Yes. Under recent legislation, the police have the right to search and protect and confine people who protest about the invasion by drilling companies on agricultural land. Related to the same issue, you may notice that they've increased by tenfold the fines that can be imposed by people who protest about fracking. Similar legislation already exists in Tasmania and Western Australia. And those states, of course, were given the cue by the federal government, which has passed 40 anti-terrorist laws, put 40 anti-terrorist laws on the statute books. And that, in a way, reflected the the Protection of Sovereign Borders Act of last year, which punishes doctors, social workers, and other people who work in offshore detention if they report about human rights abuses. So the suppression of protest is essential to the thinking of people in Australian states and in Canberra, as it's taken for granted in countries whom we would take for granted were authoritarian. Let me highlight now briefly why the BDS movement is so important as a form of encouragement to us, not only to support the Palestinian people, but to oppose the criminalisation of protest all over the place. There was a modest article a few weeks ago by 3 Jewish Australians in New Matilda, in which they argued that the BDS movement did not, the BDS movement was able to have dialogue with sections of the Zionist community. And for arguing that, then there was a whole load of vitriol that was thrown at them, saying that the BDS movement was a hateful organisation intent on the destruction of Israel. It came mostly from Victoria, but I'm not in the business of arguing whether those groups are worse in one part of Australia or the other. But when you think about it, the BDS movement takes its legitimacy from the Charter of the United Nations about the rights of indigenous people to self-determination. So it's based on international law, it's non-violent, it wants to end the occupation, to insist on the right of return, and yet it's regarded as some kind of violent movement designed and plotted by the kind of people who come to politics in the pub. What's it trying to do? It's not only going to end the occupation, but trying to end the cruel siege of that narrow strip of land of Gaza, where a UN report about 18 months ago said that by 2020, which is tomorrow, you won't be able to drink the water, the sewage system is almost broken down, there's a massive deterioration in the quality of educational and health services, and there is no the idea of academic freedom is a mirage. So that even if children in Gaza and on the West Bank can go to school, they have to do so by a very circuitous route, which is also dangerous. That's assuming that there are schools to go to. I mean, there were 26 in Operation Protective Edge. There were 26 schools completely destroyed. There were 122 severely damaged. Even when Palestinians can finish up on university or college campuses, they're really under enormous restrictions to be able to say anything. So the question then becomes, why in this movement to suppress free speech and to stifle protests, why is Israel an exception? Why do we regard the stealing of other people's lands as something you cannot protest about? In the words of the wonderful Gideon Levy, the journalist from Haaretz, we've made it a crime to protest about a crime. It's a truly Orwellian situation that we're being asked to collude with. Across American campuses, professors who are pro-Palestinian have been dismissed. Students who are pro the BDS movement, rather, are suspended or threatened with expulsion. Student groups which support BDS have been defunded. There's a sort of atmosphere of McCarthyism that is obvious in America and can easily grow roots elsewhere. The Public Affairs Committee, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, which is probably the strongest lobby in the United States, campaigns across America to have the BDS movement to support for the BDS movement made into a criminal offense. Andrew Cuomo, the Democratic governor of New York, has instructed one of his commissioners to compile a list of the individuals and organizations which support the BDS movement. This is a repeat of the Un-American Activities Committee thinking. And one of the worst people to ingratiate herself to the Israeli lobby is likely to be almost certain to be the next president. She contacted a close billionaire friend of hers called Haim Sabah last year. He's a billionaire. He's a self-promoting champion of Israel. And she assured him that she would regard the BDS movement as anti-Semitic. So let's just finish up with, and Peter will probably do this far better than me. Let's have a look at this business of why is any slight question about the barbaric behavior of the government of Israel treated as anti-Semitic, treated as though it is a criticism of all the people of Israel, let alone of all Jews. It's manifestly not, but it gets trotted out in a lazy manner at the drop of a hat. So that is something to be resisted. There's a wonderful professor of philosophy in Columbia, a Jewish professor, Josephine Butler. Have I got her name?
Judith Butler.
Judith Butler. Sorry, Judith Butler, who argues that to stop criticism of Israel is in itself an outrageous form of censorship. And that it is as though, she says, there is not in the traditions of Judaism enormous respect for and encouragement of disputation in all, and the encouragement of disputation in all cultures and religions. So where do we go from here? How do we insist on these precious rights about freedom of speech? Socrates and Voltaire and the people who crafted the Declaration of Human Rights said were the highest aspirations of ordinary people. Where do we go in that respect? I cut some of my radical teeth, I don't think that they're all that sharp these days, in the civil rights movement in the States. And I remember Martin Luther King saying about boycott, because that's what we're being asked to do as one arm of the BDS movement, that it was merely as an effort to resist cooperating with evil. And then he said it wasn't an heroic act, it was just a moral obligation. But there is, of course, an enormous fear to take a stand. I mean, fear is all over the place because a minister for strategic affairs in the Knesset, in the Israeli cabinet last year, instructed the Israeli Secret Service to make the connection between the boycott, divestment, sanction movement and terrorist organizations and terrorist states. In other words, what should enter the conventional wisdom is that BDS equals a form of terrorism. So we have to overcome the fear not to protest. And I think one of the issues that maybe we'll talk about in the audience, because there's several people in the audience, maybe everybody who can think about this, one of the worst forms of stopping or stifling protest is self-censorship. Universities are full of appalling bureaucracy and management and box ticking and performance indicators and God knows what. It all amounts to a form of self-censorship. People don't want to put their hand up. I would help you, but so the fear, not learning to overcome fear, is going to be a crucial part of our agenda. And you can't get better encouragement than from looking at the inaugural speech of Nelson Mandela when he said, to address injustice, you have to overcome the fear within yourself. Once you do that, your very presence is a witness for justice, is what he said. And I'll finish up with a tribute to a good friend of ours, perhaps the greatest jurist in the Western world, the wonderful Richard Falk. Professor of international law at Princeton and Santa Barbara. That's not a bad gig, is it? If you can get that. And he wrote about, and of course he was the special rapporteur for the occupied territories, appointed originally by Kofi Annan. And he wrote about the BDS movement, that it represented a hope to write the future of Palestine in the language of human rights and not in the bloody deeds of warfare. And I think that's where I should finish.
Beautiful.